These were the 12-story blocks of flats at G Street, Finsbury, the first of Britain's skyscrapers. Modern architecture, sound building and up-to-date design make them not only the highest flats in the country, but also among the most comfortable.
30 years ago, the voice of Eamon Andrews announced to the British working class, "This will be your life." Today, Britain faces its worst housing crisis since wartime. A government report last week confirmed that essential repairs to council homes could total £19 billion. Britain has hundreds of problem estates. Thousands of flats and homes are desired by no one, least of all by the people who live in them. They find it difficult to bring up their children. They worry about crime and vandalism. They feel anxious even in the streets near their own homes. Tonight, World in Action talks to two controversial housing pioneers of the 1980s. Alice Coleman, an authority on housing design, has analysed why so many estates fail to work. She's been called in as a troubleshooter to look at some of Britain's worst urban blight.
Then it's very easy to do.
Architect Rod Hackney specialises in salvaging derelict streets and has become an advisor to Prince Charles on inner-city regeneration. Both condemn past mistakes. Both have a vision of a future that works.
If we can say there are 15 things wrong with this estate, let us cure as many of those things together, not just one, then I think that there will be spectacular improvements and people will feel very much happier, much more content, and social malaise will shrink away.
It's staring ourselves in the face. The solution is there. You match the unemployed energy with the needs of a decaying environment. And you train those very people that don't have a job, don't have a skill, to improve their own environment. And instead of paying them to be on the dole, you're paying them to improve their areas.
Alice Coleman is Director of Land Use Research at King's College London. For the last 5 years, she's led a team of researchers in a unique project, a comprehensive study of what works and what fails in housing design. She firmly believes that by changing design, the quality of people's lives can be dramatically improved.
It's not that the knowledge of housing problems is anything new. So many people are aware of them, especially the tenants who have to live in it. But everybody has been ascribing them to different things, blaming architects, blaming tenants, blaming children and so on. And what we wanted to do was to try to pin down exactly what was wrong with some firm evidence, so that we'd be in a much better position to do something to correct it with greater success. So what we did was to map over 4,000 blocks of flats and over 4,000 houses and look at their design features and then look at the way in which society was breaking down in them.
But what is a well-designed home? In Alice Coleman's survey, the most successful home was the most traditional, the old-fashioned semi-detached or terraced house with garden. Hartlepool is a town with very high unemployment, but it also has well-kept and well-liked council estates. It resisted the trends of the 60s. The tallest buildings are still the churches. So what is the secret of these streets?
They look very ordinary, so that people just don't realise that there are many small design features packed in here that are socially stabilising. For example, all the land is divided up between the houses, so you know exactly what's yours and what's your neighbour's. And from the point of view of children coming along this street, if they just attempt to wander into somebody else's house, then they're immediately hauled back and told, no, that belongs to Mrs. Jones. And so they learn, almost unconsciously, that they respect private property. There's a fence here that's pretty nearly waist high, which is a good height because it defines the territory. There are bay windows, so that people inside can see up and down the street and see who's approaching. There's a front garden which lets them make their individual mark. Their roses are not the same colour as other people's roses, and that means that they're working in the garden, the neighbour may be working in the garden, they get to know each other quite naturally over the garden fence, so a community builds up quite well.
It's a friendly neighbourhood and we just all get on very well. Plus I've got my mum and my two sisters that live round the corner, you know.
Very rare there's trouble of any kind, isn't there, really? You know, everybody gets on with everybody else, you know, you just give and take.
I would expect on a street like this that crime would be very low. There's just purely the front gate. You can either go up to the front door or you can go through the tunnel into the back, but there's no back gate, there's no way in which criminals could easily get in. So there's only one way in and one way out to his territory, and the homeowner feels secure.
But Hartlepool was the exception, not the rule. Post-war Britain was to be swept by an enthusiasm for new building methods and new designs. Local politicians believed it cheaper and quicker to demolish the old housing stock. Bricks were out, concrete was in.
Oh my, it makes you want to cry. This is the house that Jack built, baby, and it reaches up to the sky.
In a few years, a new landscape had arrived in urban Britain. The greatest architects of the age designed the new blocks of flats, and the higher they built, the more subsidy governments gave. Alice Coleman believes that, unlike ordinary streets, blocks like these in Hackney Wick, London, contain basic design errors, errors which encourage social breakdown.
We mapped litter and graffiti, vandal damage, excrement in the entrances, the number of children in care. We looked at 9 types of residential crime, and we've been able to find a number of design features where, as they change, all these measures become worse. We can just walk in. There's nothing to signal that it belongs to these people any more than anyone else. There's no fence, no gate, or anything of that kind. And the result is that nobody looks after it because it doesn't seem to be theirs. There's all this litter and nobody feels responsible for it. I would feel rather frightened about walking into some of them at night because they're so narrow and so dark, and they go round corners and you can't see who's there lurking. This is the entrance to people's home. Concrete steps, smeared with paint, graffiti on the walls. And then we come up to another walkway where normally people can get in from another angle. And then if you go round here, just look at it. Somebody's been boring a hole in the brick, they've set fire to something, it's smothered with graffiti. This is meant to be the entrance to someone's home, and it looks like the Black Hole of Calcutta.
But where can be the heart that sends a family to the 20th floor in such a slab as this? It can't be right, however fine the view over to Greenwich and the Isle of Dogs. It can't be right. Caged halfway up the sky, not knowing your neighbour, frightened of the lift and who'll be in it and who's down below. And are the children safe?
What do you find are the main problems with lifts?
Well, all sorts of things. People are afraid of them. Once you get inside, it's claustrophobic. It's like being trapped in a cell. And then you don't know who you're travelling with. Even if you're getting by yourself, it may stop at any floor. And somebody who isn't going to do you any good may get in. You're at their mercy. And they break down. People are afraid of being trapped in them.
Can you tell me how often this happens?
50 to 60 times a month, each month. Sometimes you get 5 or 6 in a night. No trouble at all. What's the longest time you can remember that someone's been locked in one of these?
4 or 5 hours sometimes. Quite often the alarm bell has been vandalised, so that it's only people kicking and banging on the door that brings attention to the fact that there's still somebody in there.
And you come out of the lift, which is a prison in itself. You come out onto a bare, dusty landing with no one here. You walk across, not seeing a soul, and then you get into your house with a sigh of relief. But on the way, there's no communication with anyone. It's not like being in a house where perhaps you're working in the front garden a bit and you talk to the people who go past and a community builds up. It's all very soulless, very anonymous here, and this is why it's so difficult to get a really good community in blocks of flats.
The old community of Hackney Wick was based around these terraces, demolished to make way for the present estate. They were typical of thousands of streets which vanished under slum clearance and compulsory purchase schemes throughout Britain. The mill town of Macclesfield had hundreds of unmodernised terrace houses. By the late 1960s, many were in a poor condition and facing demolition. One such terrace was Black Road. The residents feared rehousing and began a long campaign to save their area. They approached a young, recently qualified architect who had just moved into Black Road. Rod Hackney would later become an advisor to Prince Charles. The Macclesfield project would make his name.
It was a partnership. I could offer a skill, I could articulate their case, and they could provide the energy. It was no good me having an idea if they didn't back it with their dreams. They wanted to stay, they understood the properties were poor, but they didn't want to go through the upheaval of having to leave simply to remedy the poor quality of the properties.
As well as an architect doing good design for what we wanted, individual design, he also did the legal side of it. He applied for grants for people. He became like a godfather, you could say. He was with us all the time. With community architecture, we got 24-hour supervision.
I was able to show them how they could persuade the bureaucrats, the council officials, and the elected representatives that they weren't a threat.
Rod Hackney was on site to give advice and organise any difficult work with contractors, but most of the modernisation work was done by the residents, their families and friends.
They were, in fact, offering an alternative way of working that could well enhance the housing policy in the borough. As you can see, it is a success, particularly for them. The houses are nice, but most important, they've regenerated themselves as human beings.
You know, it's made us a very close-knit community. We've got friends we didn't think we had. We're good neighbours, but without being nosy neighbours, if you understand me. If one came for help, we would rally around. By involving the youth around in the area, the neighbours, it has certainly helped to protect our scheme, because now they're proud to have been a part of it, and they'll say to friends, hey, you mustn't go down there swinging on that tree, I planted that, and, you know, or don't damage Mrs Swan's door, I painted all that, it took a long while. So, the youth are really, they protect the scheme.
That's excellent, Jenny. Let's do it all on the 21st.
The success of the Macclesfield project brought Rod Hackney national fame. Soon he was called the founder of community architecture.
Excellent, Jenny.
Earlier this year, he stood at the shoulder of Prince Charles on a tour of the Black Road scheme. He is, by appointment, pundit-in-chief on the inner cities at the court of the Prince of Wales.
What is it, do you think, about community architecture which attracts the Prince?
I think his belief that small things are good, and if you keep things within a human dimension, the end product is well within the appreciation of ordinary human beings. He likes to see the involvement of ordinary people in their solution, in the solution of their housing problems. And I think, most important of all, he wants to see the housing problem solved. And if that can be achieved, it's no more, no less than we should expect in a developed country. He said himself that if the Black Road example could be repeated elsewhere, then this is one solution to the housing problem of the inner cities.
They call my house a slum, but my house wasn't a slum. And at that time, my wife said it was fit for royalty to come in, not thinking that one day Prince Charles actually walked through my front door. He said it was a very charming little cottage.
Since his pioneering work at Macclesfield, Rod Hackney has set up a number of projects throughout the country. The aim is to preserve, not to demolish. In Stirling in Scotland, there was a 4-year waiting list for council houses. This street was derelict and vandalised. Hackney arranged finance with the council and building societies. For the unemployed, DHSS payments have been accepted for mortgages. One of his architects is always on site, handing out advice and arranging any difficult work with contractors. But everybody has chosen to do most of the work themselves or with the help of friends.
We have a lot of miners in this area, and then ordinary people, factory workers, office workers. People, there are some people who've had building experience, but they're the minority. But the best results seem to come from the people who have never yet laid a block in their life. They're enthused, they're keen, and they're willing to learn. There are people in the scheme who perhaps didn't think they could do it, but by the end of it, like these people here, this person was a motor mechanic and his wife is a cleaner, had no previous experience of building.
Did you ever think of yourself as builders before?
No.
You ever laid a brick before?
No.
No.
Ever put in a window?
No.
Ever done anything like this before?
No.
No.
At least I know once it's done, I've done it, and I won't be able to. I'll know that it's done right. Instead of moving like a house has been built for you, I know that I've done this myself. I'll be able to sit back with my feet up in front of the fire, say I built this house.
I believe that if we're to have good, successful housing, you must involve the user. And by doing that, you often come up against people that say, we are the legitimate representatives of the people. We are the council, we are the government, we're the building trade, we're the professions. We have a way of working, let's keep to it. But we've tried that way, and I think we have room for an alternative way, which is to involve ordinary people. All the schemes that we do are small. One community architect can cope with about 30 houses a year. But if you add together many small schemes, you start to make some inroads into the problem of British housing. The secret for the inner cities in the UK is not to think on such a large scale that you have to sacrifice people's individual wishes. These people will be a community when they're finished, and hopefully the next scheme will be done, and the scheme after that. And it'll all add up.
Hackney believes his methods can revitalise run-down older properties. His vision is to create thousands of small, community-based projects across hundreds of towns and cities. But there remain untouched these sprawling estates of the 60s and 70s. Tower blocks had been abandoned long before they built the North Peckham estate in London. Although it rises no higher than 5 stories, this estate has many of the design features condemned by Alice Coleman. Yet, when it was completed in 1973, the designers were convinced that they had planned well. They described it as a city village, as fine a housing estate as you will find anywhere in this country, and possibly in Europe.
I mean, I won't open my front door after 8 o'clock at night unless I know who it is. I mean, I had to ring on the bell at 11 o'clock at night, peek through the spiral, and there's no way I was going to open that door because I never know what's waiting on the other side.
The courts, which recreate the grace and proportions of the city square, have been designed as places where children can play safely, said the designers.
This estate has crime, burglaries, it has rape, mugging, arson. It has 1 fire for every 5 dwellings in a year.
The walkways link all parts of the estate through an interlocking series of ramps, stairs and lifts to furnish safe, traffic-free routes, said the planners.
We've found that walkways like that, linkages between blocks, are really the worst thing for spreading crime between different blocks.
Can't go out for night time, you're too frightened. Well, there's too many walkways and there's loads of places where people can hide and pounce out on you. That's right. There's so many muggings on this estate, it's terrible. Half of these landings should be shut off because they've got too many exits to them.
In recent months, Alice Coleman's advice has been sought by councils who've tried every other method of improving their worst estates. For North Peckham, she's advising that surgery is required.
What we'd like to do here is to drive streets through that become streets of houses. Take the top 2 floors off so that the bottom of the block is left as a series of houses in a terrace. Make that into a proper front garden wall, put front gardens on there, make the street wide enough for people to be able to park their cars where they can see them from their windows, and make it as much like the traditional street as we can.
Alice Coleman's new ideas have already been tested by an architect working independently who arrived at similar conclusions. This is the Lee View Estate, Hackney. When it was built in 1939, it was called Heaven in Hackney. By the mid-70s, it was more like hell. Designer John Thompson.
We arrived in the autumn of 1980, 5 years ago, and we found not only that the building fabric had completely deteriorated, but so the community spirit. Tenants were extremely dejected. There was a lot of vandalism. Ground floor flats were boarded up because people were breaking in and mugging elderly people.
If anybody asked me where I lived, I just used to say Stamford Hill because I didn't want anybody to know that I lived on Lee View. It was so bad that I just went and bought myself the most ferocious dog I could find because I was literally terrified to be in that place over there on my own.
John Thompson's firm combined community architecture and the design changes favoured by Alice Coleman in their plan to revive Lee View. They talked with the tenants. They decided to redesign the whole block and are now halfway through renovation. The block has been turned inside out and tenants given front doors onto the streets, instead of the old communal entrances inside the courtyard.
This is completely different.
The new language is, I think you can see, is somewhat more cheerful and colourful. Basically, we have houses on the ground. These are either 2- or 3-storey houses with their own front door, and they're completely private units. They don't share any space with any other tenants. This block was handed over towards the end of the summer, and you can see people are responding and doing all the things that anybody does when they have a house of their own.
The new grass is coming up nicely, and they've actually got some flowers going.
And we've now got a lot of eyes on the street, and all the things that you say will happen in your book do happen, and we've had virtually no break-ins at all in the new blocks, whereas the rest of the estate is still having a very high level of break-ins. We've had virtually no vandalism, tenants' physical and mental health. Some fascinating stories from people of how their health's improved, how people have come off supportive drugs and things. The quality of people's life and their own personalities have blossomed through having decent housing for the first time.
So you're really proving that design does make a big difference to people's lives.
There's no question about it. People that were living in housing in the old staircases were doing nothing about their own environment. They were living in appalling housing conditions. The moment they move, they just blossom.
I know nearly everybody now, whereas before you were closed in behind your door and that was it. You didn't know anybody. Now, I can't go down the shop without an hour where I know so many people. Most days you go past here and my front door's always open. That's how I feel towards this place.
Still have the dog?
No, I've got rid of the dog and got a little cat now.
I'm very impressed. This is a rehabilitation which involves design and not just sprucing it up. There's some very thoughtful work gone into making several of the designs that are so bad different and better.
Last week, the Chancellor of the Exchequer announced that spending on housing would rise by £220 million, a small part of the £19 billion needed to renovate council homes. But Alice Coleman isn't convinced that even that increase will be spent wisely.
I do feel that it's so easy to think that if you just spend that money on perhaps putting in entry ferns, which are then going to be vandalised, or decorating the estate, or making it just look nicer, that you've done something. But on the other hand, if it can be used to improve design, then we think that there can be quite spectacular changes for the better.
I think the government's going to have to rethink, because there are a lot of people willing to participate in their own destiny. They want to help. That I see as a resource of human endeavour. And I think together with local authorities and major financial institutions that are willing to liberally interpret the rules to allow ordinary people into the building process, I think we have a very good future.
If you were to be given complete freedom, what would Alice Coleman's Britain look like in 30 years' time?
I hope it wouldn't be Alice Coleman's Britain. I hope it would be the Britain of the people who have to live in the houses, because one thing I feel very strongly is that people should have control in shaping their own living space.
After a long struggle, the people of Hackney Wick have made their choice. Streets, small houses and gardens. The tower block is to go.